Welcome back, dear audience, to Audio Night Narration. In tonight's broadcast, we invite you to listen to the chilling story, Meeting a Ghost at Night. A thrilling and spine-tingling tale that promises to bring unforgettable moments of suspense. Turn off the lights, grab a warm cup of tea, and immerse yourself in every haunting word echoing through the silent night. Let's enjoy the story together. The distant howls of a dog echoed through the quiet village. Under the dim glow of the flickering streetlights, a golden-furred dog paced restlessly, its tail flicking anxiously, its sharp eyes fixated on the darkness beyond the village path, barking ceaselessly as if warning of an unseen presence approaching its territory. Madame Lean sat on the wooden bench, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the house, an uneasiness settling deep within her chest. The dog's incessant barking filled the silence of the night, yet she paid it no mind. Her heart was occupied with a greater worry. Meanwhile, her husband, Feng, lay back in a hammock, lazily swaying to the rhythm of an old Kai Luong melody. He seemed unbothered, lost in the nostalgic tunes. Lean turned back inside, snatched up a nearby conical hat, and tossed it toward him in frustration. "Where on earth is Mai? It's already past 10, and she still hasn't come home," she huffed. Feng, unperturbed, took a sip of his tea and smacked his lips. "She's just over at Uncle China's place, playing with two. It's only a short ride away, and it's all neighbors around here. What's there to worry about?" But Lean frowned. He would never understand a mother's anxiety. It was late, too late for a young girl to be out alone. The entire village had already shut their doors and dimmed their lights. Worse, Mai's old bicycle no longer had a working headlamp after a recent fall. Ghosts? Lean never feared them. The dead could only scare, never harm. It was the living that truly sent shivers down her spine. Just then, the dim glow of the phone screen broke through the darkness. A message. It was from Mai. She explained that her friend had gotten too drunk, so she borrowed Uncle China's motorbike to take her home. She reassured her mother not to worry. She had a flashlight with her and was already on her way back. Lean let out a long sigh of relief. The road leading from their house to the district had just been fitted with streetlights, making it much brighter than before. Besides, there were still households awake in the busier parts of town. Mai would be fine. Setting down the phone, she resumed her work, weaving a half-finished chair. With a tired sigh, she snapped at the restless dog. "Quit, Vang. Enough with that racket." The Feng family lived in a small alley branching off from the main road, leading toward the district. A few turns down familiar paths would bring one home in mere minutes. Life in the countryside was never easy. Their earnings were modest, barely enough to scrape by. That was why they had only one child, Mai. Nearly 18, she had just finished her graduation exams and was enjoying her first taste of freedom. Tonight, she had eagerly rushed to Tu's house the moment she had permission, savoring every chance to be with friends. Feng worked the fields and took odd jobs whenever possible, while Lean busied herself with housework and occasional handicrafts, weaving chairs to earn a little extra. She doted on Mai, raising her with a strict hand, which was why the girl rarely went out. But when she did, she was reluctant to return. On the other side of the village, Mai tucked her phone into her pocket and shot a glare at her friend. "Dung. See what you did? I told you she couldn't drink, and now look at her. Completely wasted. Now we have to deal with this mess." Dung only grinned mischievously, tapping the back seat of the motorbike. "Hop on. Let's drop her off and head home." They had barely ridden 100 meters when Dung nudged Mai's arm. "Hey, want to take a little detour? I heard there's a night fair by the riverside. They say it's open really late." A faint breeze swept through the road, carrying with it the whispers of the unknown. The village was quiet, the shadows stretching long under the streetlights, and somewhere in the distance, the golden-furred dog let out another low, ominous growl. Mai was bursting with excitement, eager to explore the world beyond the confines of her home. Her mother kept her sheltered, but tonight, she had finally broken free. The fair only came around once a week, and Mai wanted to savor every moment. She even convinced Dung to stay out until dawn, craving a taste of life outside her small, familiar world. Hearing Mai's enthusiasm, Dung laughed and playfully steered their motorbike toward the distant glow of the market lights. The streets were nearly empty, save for the scattered stalls packing up early as the night breeze grew sharper. The wind rattled through the banana leaves lining the road, their shadows swaying like ghostly figures. Seeing the vendors closing shop, Mai's excitement dimmed, but Dung reassured her, promising they'd come earlier next time. They turned the bike around, the hum of the engine filling the silence of the desolate road. As they rode, Mai couldn't shake the eerie chill creeping up her spine. The back of her neck prickled with cold, a sensation so unnatural it made her shiver. Curious, she reached back, but her fingers met only her own skin, cold as stone. Unease gnawed at her, and she twisted around to glance behind them. Nothing, only the dim remnants of the fair, fading into darkness. She sighed, hugging Dung's waist tightly, unaware that when she had turned so sharply, something had slipped off her body and landed on the road. The bike sped off, leaving behind a faint, shifting silhouette by the riverbank. The water beneath it bubbled, gray and murky, as though something ancient stirred beneath the surface. By the time Mai returned home, it was past 11 p.m. Her golden dog, Vang, rushed to greet her, only to freeze, sniffing her anxiously. Then, it bared its teeth and growled, staring at the nape of her neck. Startled, Mai picked him up, scolding him for acting strangely. But Vang squirmed, frantically licking the very spot where Mai had felt the unnatural chill. Her mother's sharp voice cut through the tension, scolding Mai for coming home so late. She glared at the antique wall clock, its pendulum swaying ominously as it crept toward midnight. Deflated, Mai slumped against the door, venting to Vang about her mother's overprotectiveness. The dog, as if understanding her frustration, gave her a few comforting licks before slipping out of her grasp and darting toward the front gate. Curious, Mai followed. Vang frantically dug at the earth, paws flinging dirt in every direction. Just as Mai reached to pick him up, a streak of lightning illuminated the sky, casting twisted shadows across the yard. Vang gagged, then vomited something dark and indistinguishable before hurriedly burying it. Mai, unnerved, gathered him up and went inside, locking the door behind her. Outside, the freshly disturbed soil began to darken, faint tendrils of black smoke seeping out and dispersing into the cold night air. The scent of decay lingered, only to be swiftly swallowed by the wind. Inside, Mai showered, trying to shake the night's strange occurrences. But as the clock struck midnight, and the house fell into heavy silence, the chill returned. This time, it wasn't just on her neck. It wrapped around her like unseen fingers, tightening ever so slowly as she drifted into uneasy sleep. Tonight, Mai felt exhausted and disheartened by her mother's words. She decided to slip into bed early, hoping sleep would wash away her gloom. But just as she was finishing changing clothes, the bathroom light flickered wildly. She frowned, puzzled. Hadn't her father just replaced the bulb not long ago? She thought about calling her mother for help, but before she could, the curtain behind her fluttered free from the bathroom wall. The family's bathroom was built separately from the house, just 10 steps away. Its walls were made of woven leaves, and the entrance was merely a thin curtain, since the backyard only faced an expansive guava orchard. The nearest house was far beyond sight, with an ancient tree towering over the orchard, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal fingers. The wind whispered through the leaves, making the curtain billow like a ghostly veil.
Mai shivered.
As the curtain lifted, it revealed the vast orchard, lush with verdant guava trees. But then Mai's heart nearly stopped. She saw a figure dressed in white, sitting on a branch, weeping. Her vision wasn't great, and the dim light made everything hazy. She told herself it was probably just her father's gardening clothes, left to dry and forgotten. As she tried to rationalize the sight, the bathroom light suddenly steadied, and the curtain dropped back into place. Mai quickly finished dressing, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped back into the house. The white figure faded into the darkness the moment she turned her back, and the bathroom light went out with an ominous finality. The orchard, vast and quiet, seemed to swallow the night whole. Inside, her mother, Mrs. Lean, ironed a white shirt while mumbling to her husband about their daughter's strange behavior that day. Worry weighed heavily on her. The family was small, just the three of them. If anything happened to Lean didn't know how she would survive the heartbreak. She talked for a while, her words met with silence. Turning, she saw her husband, Mr. Feng, had fallen asleep. Lean sighed, folded the shirt, and turned off the light. She lay in bed, pulling a white blanket over herself, but sleep refused to come. Her thoughts drifted back to a memory she had tried to bury. A day of horror, years ago. Mai had been only 5. She wore a pink dress and toddled along the small village path leading to the market. She was supposed to turn toward the cement bridge, but instead, she saw her mother rowing a boat home, laden with crops. The little girl waved and called out in her sweet, babbling voice, "Mama! Mama!" Lean beamed and waved back, her heart swelling with love. Mai was an obedient child, always waiting for her mother by the bridge when the sun reached the treetops. But that day, instead of staying on the path, Mai stepped closer to the riverbank. The soil crumbled beneath her feet. She fell into the water without a sound. Lean's heart lurched. She screamed, ready to dive into the river. But before she could, a middle-aged man named Mr. Bay, who used to ferry passengers across the river, leapt into action. He plunged into the water and pulled Mai onto his boat. Bay had once been a boatman, steering people and their bicycles across the river before the cement bridge was built. Though his job had vanished, he still rowed out sometimes to fish, nostalgic for the water. That day, his lingering attachment to the river saved Mai's life. But something had changed. From that day on, Mai was never quite the same. She became frail, prone to sickness, and the lively spark in her eyes dimmed. Once fearless and playful, she now shied away from the world, her steps cautious, her voice quieter. Lean and Feng took her to the hospital, desperate for answers, but the doctors found nothing wrong. Still, Lean couldn't shake the feeling that part of Mai had been left behind in the river, swallowed by the currents, lost to the depths. After that incident, Mrs. Lean continued working in the fields for a few more months before quitting entirely to stay home and care for her daughter. Worry for Mai's safety gnawed at her heart, making her increasingly strict, forbidding Mai from going out, especially at night. If Mai had to attend classes, either Mrs. Lean or Mr. Feng would take turns escorting her. One evening, as Mrs. Lean sat lost in a whirlpool of memories, a gentle rain began to patter against the roof. The sky grumbled with distant thunder, and soon enough, a storm raged outside. The wind howled, bending grass and small shrubs as sheets of rain lashed the earth. A flash of lightning tore through the darkness, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the heavens. Mai startled awake, her heart pounding. Her bed was placed near the window, which she had forgotten to close in her exhaustion. Lightning illuminated the room in flickering bursts, casting sharp, fleeting shadows. She squinted, annoyed, and curled herself deeper into the corner of the bed, attempting to block out the storm's fury. Yet, just as she began to drift back to sleep, an unsettling sensation crept over her. Her eyes snapped open, and through the flashes of light, she saw a figure. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, tall and lean. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers and a plain white shirt, soaked through by the relentless rain. Water dripped from his hair, forming small puddles on the cold, tiled floor. His face, gentle and devoid of malice, watched her in silence. Mai rubbed her eyes, whispering to herself that it must be a hallucination. Maybe it was the beer she had earlier. Maybe she was just overtired. But another flash of lightning blazed through the room, and Mai jolted upright, her chest tightening with fear. The storm had drenched her mattress, rain seeping through the open window. She hastily shut it and turned on the light, only to freeze. Puddle, right where the man had stood. Her breath hitched as chills crept up her spine. She told herself it was just the rain, just the storm, nothing more. Grabbing an old towel, she cautiously dropped it onto the water, careful not to touch it directly. Then, she climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head, willing herself to forget the phantom figure. But the nights that followed offered her no peace. Mai's health began to deteriorate. She grew weaker, plagued by unexplained fevers that flared up only at night. The doctors found nothing wrong. Apart from her sudden frailty, Mai remained mentally alert, her spirit seemingly untouched. Mrs. Lean worried endlessly but chalked it up to her daughter's poor appetite and weakened immune system. Each night, sleep became a battle for Mai, her body restless and weary, and tonight was no different. As she teetered on the edge of slumber, she felt it. A gentle hand brushing against her own, a soft voice calling her name. She opened her eyes to see him again, the ethereal young man with a serene smile and eyes as tranquil as still water. He told her he wanted to take her somewhere. For as long as she could remember, Mai had been sheltered, her world confined by her mother's well-meaning restrictions. She had rarely interacted with anyone outside her family, least of all boys. Yet, something about the stranger's gaze unraveled her defenses, and she found herself nodding and trusting him with her fragile heart. He led her away, beyond the confines of her room, beyond reality itself. And before her stretched a boundless sea, shimmering beneath an endless night sky. Just 20 steps away, several massive rocks sat by the shore, perfect for resting and gazing at the vast sea. The salty breeze whispered through the air, promising serenity. The man turned to Mai, gently taking her hand as he led her forward. Mai's heart fluttered with a mixture of excitement and unease. She had never been to this place before. The landscape was both unfamiliar and heartbreakingly beautiful. Yet, the man beside her radiated a quiet safety, making her cherish this strange little adventure even more. But midway through their walk, he vanished without a trace. Mai spun around, her chest tightening, expecting to see his kind, gentle eyes. Instead, a figure loomed in the distance, a twisted mockery of human form. It wasn't him, couldn't be him. The creature's body swelled like an overfilled balloon, its surface slick and glistening, dripping with thick, mud-like ooze that seeped into the sand. There were no discernible features, just an amorphous face of sludge, as if someone had shaped a human figure from clay and animated it with a sinister force. It trudged toward her, each step leaving behind decaying impressions in the sand. The closer it drew, the larger and more menacing it became. Mai's instincts screamed at her to run, but behind her stretched the endless, roaring sea. Waves crashed against the shore, relentless and hungry, as if eager to swallow her whole. She imagined herself slipping beneath the surface, her breath stolen, body sinking into the abyss. At that very moment, in a quiet room not far away, Mrs. Lean stirred awake. Mr. Feng slept soundly, oblivious, while his wife prepared to head to the market to buy something nourishing for their daughter. It was only 5 in the morning, the rain having just ceased, and the streets still shrouded in darkness. She fumbled through her bag for a flashlight, but after rummaging for a while, she realized she must have left it inside the house. As she returned to fetch it, a strange compulsion tugged at her heart, urging her to check on Mai. Pushing open the bedroom door, she was met with an unsettling sight. The mosquito net had collapsed, draping over her daughter like a suffocating veil. Mai writhed beneath it, her body twitching and convulsing, soaked in a cold, clammy sweat. Panic surged through Mrs. Lean as she rushed to her daughter's side, shaking her with desperate hands. "Mai, wake up!" she cried, voice trembling. Mai jolted awake, gasping for air as though she had been underwater for hours. Tears streaked her face as she clung to her mother, voice quivering as she recounted the nightmare. The looming figure, the suffocating fear, and the moment she stumbled backward into the sea just as her mother shook her awake. Mrs. Lean held her daughter close, heart hammering. When dawn finally broke, she urged Mai to wash her face and rest in her room while she stripped the bedding to cleanse it in the well. The lingering dread gnawed at her, so after preparing breakfast, she sent Mr. Feng to watch over Mai and hurried to the market. There, she sought out Mrs. Hoa, an old friend who was deeply spiritual. Upon hearing the story, Mrs. Hoa's expression darkened, and she quickly scrawled an address on a scrap of paper. The home of a revered spiritual healer who lived in the neighboring village. "Take Mai to him," she whispered, eyes grave, "before it's too late." Hope flickered in Mrs. Lean's chest as she clutched the paper, silently vowing to protect her daughter from whatever shadow had begun to haunt her dreams. At home, Mr. Feng sat at the tea table, his eyes lingering on Mai as she happily munched on a guava dipped in salt. Yet his heart was a tempest of worries. Perhaps, to Mrs. Lean, keeping Mai sheltered indoors was an act of protection. But to him, it was the very reason their daughter had grown fragile, unlike other children her age. He recalled a time when he took Mai to a temple. She had clung to his hand, trembling, her voice quivering with fear as she begged to leave. Yet, the moment they stepped outside, she returned to her normal self, as if nothing had happened. It was this memory that fueled his suspicion. Maybe her constant illnesses stemmed not from her body but from something unseen. After all, countless hospital visits had yielded no answers. Just then, the excited barking of their dog echoed from the yard, signaling Mrs. Lean's return. Mr. Feng quickly masked his distress, joining her in the kitchen to prepare dinner. He said nothing, thinking that perhaps this visit to the master might finally restore their daughter's health. After dinner, Mrs. Lean took Mai to the master's house. As they stepped into the dimly lit prayer room, incense smoke curled through the air like restless spirits. The walls were plastered with yellow talismans scrawled in crimson script, and in the center of the room stood a grand altar, the incense sticks burning down to ash. An elderly master, draped in golden robes, sat cross-legged, his eyes shut in deep meditation. Without even a word exchanged, the master spoke, his voice like an echo from another realm. "Why is she followed by a spirit?" Mrs. Lean and Mai froze, their eyes darting around the room. But aside from the heavy scent of incense and the eerie talismans, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the master's words pierced through them like icy knives. "He's been with her for years," the master continued, his gaze now fixed on Mai. "Since the day she fell into the river searching for her mother. She should have drowned, but he lifted her onto a fisherman's boat. He saved her, but a soul tethered to the living is a heavy burden. His presence has drained her life force, leaving her cold, sickly, and frail." Tears welled in Mrs. Lean's eyes as she listened, her heart pounding like a war drum. "If he saved me, why would he want to harm me now?" Mai's voice trembled. The master's eyes darkened. "He doesn't want to harm you. He wants to take you with him. In dreams, he erased your memory of him. But now, he lets you see. He wants you to follow him." The room grew colder as the master stood and handed Mai a red string with a small talisman. "Wear this, always. It will sever the bond. But be warned, he's been with you for too long. He may try to control your thoughts. No matter what happens, do not take this off." Mrs. Lean clutched Mai tightly, nodding repeatedly as the master handed Mai a cup of blessed water. "Drink this. It will weaken his hold." After finishing the water, Mrs. Lean left a thick envelope of money on the altar in gratitude. As they stepped out of the master's house, the night air clung to their skin, heavy and suffocating. Mai gripped the red string tightly, her fingers trembling as she wondered if, somewhere in the shadows, he was still watching. On the way, Mai couldn't shake off the restless unease that clung to her like a shadow. She loathed wearing the red charm necklace, but when she saw the beads of sweat glistening on her mother's forehead, guilt washed over her. She suppressed the urge to rip the charm off and toss it away, choosing instead to distract herself, hoping the discomfort would fade. Back home, life resumed its ordinary rhythm, but Mai's spirit withered. She wandered through the days like a ghost herself, melancholic, drained, her sickness showing no sign of abating. Mr. Feng, observing her decline, told Mrs. Lean, "Let Mai go out for a bit. Being cooped up all day will drive her mad, even without a lingering affliction. Mrs. Lean, trusting the exorcist who had severed her daughter's ghostly bond, reluctantly agreed. I immediately thought of Dung, who had promised to take her to the Riverside night market. It was fate, perhaps, that the market was back in town that very evening. Excited, I texted Dung and arranged to meet at the alley's entrance. She rummaged through her closet, pulling out a pure white dress. She twirled in front of the mirror, her eyes sparkling, until the whisper came. A cold breath brushed against her skin, raising every hair on her body. The voice, faint and fragmented, echoed like distant ripples on water. "My, take off the red string." Her heart thudded. The voice was unmistakably male, its tone lingering somewhere between pleading and commanding. Mai's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. Her trembling hand grasped a knife from her bedside table, pointing it toward the emptiness. But the room remained still, devoid of life. She sank onto the bed, staring at the crimson thread around her wrist. Was this the barrier keeping the man from her? If she removed it, would he finally show himself? Maybe she could talk to him, convince him to leave her alone. But her naive musings shattered when her phone rang. Dung was outside, waiting. Shoving the lingering dread aside, I changed quickly and rushed to meet her friend. The night market buzzed with life, laughter echoing like chimes in the air. The riverside sparkled with light, reflecting the market's vibrancy onto the water's surface. The cheerful crowd and Dung's animated chatter temporarily lifted my spirits. As the night deepened, I tugged on Dung's sleeve, reminding her they should head home before it got too late. On their way to the motorbike, they passed a little girl, no older than 5, dressed head to toe in red. Red shoes, red dress, a red bow perched atop her pale, ghostly face. Mai's heart lurched. The child's expression was vacant, eyes like black voids. Without a word, the girl lunged forward, snatching the red string from Mai's wrist before darting into the crowd. Mai gasped, turning to call for Dung. By the time they scanned the bustling market, the child had vanished. When Mai recounted the incident, Dung's face drained of color. She whispered that, 2 months prior, a little girl from a village 3 kilometers away had drowned in the river. The child had been obsessed with the color red, demanding anything crimson she laid eyes on.
Mais gestictenet.
An unnatural chill crept up her spine. Dung, sensing the shift in the air, grabbed Mai's hand and sped toward home. As they crossed the bridge, Mai glanced down at the river and froze. Dark, murky water bubbled unnaturally, clusters of thick, gray foam swirling like something was being stirred beneath the surface. The sight made her stomach churn, while rising as a putrid stench filled the air, the unmistakable smell of decay. I clutched her stomach, trembling. She wanted to believe the night was over, but as she turned her face away from the river, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that had just broken free. Mai had barely shut her eyes, her face contorted in pain, when a deafening crash echoed through the air. Her mind spun, and everything blurred into obscurity before she slipped into unconsciousness. The street buzzed with panic as people rushed to the scene, and soon, both victims were taken to the hospital. Upon hearing the news, Mrs. Lean abandoned her work and ran straight to the emergency room. Tears streamed down her face as she scolded herself, her voice trembling with anguish. She only had one daughter. If anything happened to Mai, how could she bear it? Mr. Feng stood beside her, offering words of comfort, though his own heart burned with silent torment. Hours passed, and finally, the door to the emergency room creaked open. The doctor emerged with an exhausted expression. "Mai only sustained minor injuries," he said. "But Dung, her leg is broken, her shoulder shows signs of a fracture, and we suspect a head injury. She's fallen into a coma and will be transferred to a higher-level hospital for specialized care. Mai will stay under observation for a week, and if nothing unusual arises, she can be discharged." After Mai was settled in her room, her parents hovered over her, inspecting every inch of her body as if their eyes could somehow heal her wounds. Mrs. Lean's heart shattered at the sight of Mai's bandaged hand. Then, she noticed something missing. The red charm bracelet the old master had insisted Mai wear at all times was gone. The next morning, as the first rays of dawn pierced the sky, Mrs. Lean rushed to the master's house, hoping for answers. But she arrived to find the door sealed shut. A nearby farmer, tending his field, told her the master had been arrested for fraud and theft. Stunned, Mrs. Lean stood frozen, her thoughts tangled in confusion and dread. Yet, she quickly regained her composure and returned to the hospital to care for her daughter. When she relayed everything to Mr. Feng, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of restrained fury. But he didn't blame his wife. Instead, he recalled a distant relative who had devoted years to Buddhist practice under a revered monk. Perhaps this monk could offer them some hope. A week later, after Mai was discharged, the family embarked on a grueling journey into the mountains. The forest loomed with ancient shadows, dew-soaked leaves clinging to their clothes as treacherous cliffs threatened their every step. Yet they pressed on, driven by love and desperation. At last, they reached a small, weathered hut by a stagnant pond, where 3 lotus flowers bloomed amidst a sea of emerald moss. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of lotus petals, creating an atmosphere of profound serenity. An elderly monk with silver hair and kind eyes greeted them with a gentle smile. After listening to their harrowing tale, he stepped outside and stood at the threshold of the forest, his frail body outlined against the dimming sky. He spoke not to the family, but to the unseen. "I see you," the monk murmured. "You are a gentle soul. Why do you linger, haunting this girl?" The forest held its breath. A soft wind stirred the earth, lifting a spiral of dust and scattering fallen leaves. The family heard nothing, but the monk nodded as though listening to someone speak. His fingers caressed his beard, and he occasionally hummed in understanding, as if the unseen presence was pouring out its sorrow. After what felt like an eternity, the monk returned to the family, his expression solemn, carrying the ghost story back from the void. The young man, named Man, drowned and his body lay hidden beneath the river's surface. Unbeknownst to his family, their inability to call his soul back left him bound to that watery grave. When he saved Mai from a similar fate, her gentle beauty captivated him, and he chose to follow her. Strangely, this mirrored the words of an old shaman who had warned of lingering spirits. Yet, perhaps the shaman's power was too feeble to perceive a darker presence, a demon that had also set its sights on Mai. On the night the market was closing, as Mai and Dung walked by the riverside, the demon stirred. It had been there for countless years, watching, waiting. Sensing Mai's fragile life force, it longed to drag her down to replace its lost soul. It licked the back of her neck, leaving a tainted mark, a gateway through which it would latch onto her spirit. Mai should have died within 3 days, her soul withering away. But that night, as she cradled her golden dog, the creature instinctively leapt up and licked the back of her neck, cleansing the mark and breaking the demon's initial hold. Furious but unrelenting, the demon found another way. It latched onto a hairpin Mai had dropped, a few strands of her hair still clinging to it, carrying remnants of her essence. It invaded her dreams, attempting to sever her spirit from her body. Man emerged from the shadows of the rain, desperately trying to shield her, but he was no match for the demon's ancient strength. All he could do was delay the inevitable. When Man took Mai out for a day of respite, the demon struck, hurling Man aside like a broken doll. Desperate, Man blurred the vision of Mai's aunt, preventing her from finding her flashlight, a delay that was enough to rouse Mai from her dream state, saving her for another night. The shaman had severed Mai's spiritual ties to lingering souls, yet his feeble abilities failed to banish Man completely. He remained, silently watching over her. One day, when Mai and Dung planned to cross the bridge over the river, Man foresaw disaster. The demon would strike there. He tried to warn her, draining his essence to whisper warnings, to urge her to remove the red bracelet warding him away. When Mai ignored the signs, Man lured a wandering child spirit who loved red to snatch the bracelet. The demon retaliated, shrouding Dung's vision in illusions, causing a catastrophic accident. Man embraced Mai, shielding her from harm, while Dung, unprotected, was left with life-threatening injuries. The family returned to the shaman, who performed another ritual, severing the last threads of demonic influence. He gifted Mai a red pendant and a vial of enchanted water, instructing her to use it for 3 days before returning. Meanwhile, Man sat silently in the corner, his ghostly form battered and torn. The shaman, seeing Man's suffering, offered to help him heal and guide him to the afterlife. But Man refused, his spectral eyes reflecting nothing but sorrow and longing. The shaman, sighing, ventured down the mountain into a village at the forest's edge. He stopped at an old moss-covered house, pushing open the rusty gate. A middle-aged woman emerged, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling. The woman revealed herself as the sister of Gwyn, the previous owner of the house. Years ago, Gwyn's life unraveled in greed and tragedy. Her biological son, steeped in vice, murdered a friend for money, and she staged her stepson's death to protect him. The truth unraveled, leading to madness. The son imprisoned in a cell for the insane, and Gwyn's corpse found near a village shrine, her spirit restless. The stepson, the boy she betrayed, was none other than Man, the soul who lingered, tethered not just to the river but to the echoes of betrayal, loss, and unfulfilled love for the girl he now sought to protect. The old man nodded thoughtfully, as if he had finally found the answer he had been seeking. He bowed politely and took his leave. In truth, he had already guessed part of the story while talking to Man. He had come only to confirm the details, and perhaps to help Man unburden his soul, the weight that kept him tethered to this world, unable to move on. After leaving Mrs. Twen's house, the old man set out for Mr. Feng and Mrs. Lin's village. He crossed a bridge arching over a wide river, the very place where little Mai had once nearly drowned. The old man stopped at the riverbank, carefully unpacking the items he had bought at the market. He arranged them meticulously, forming a small altar at the foot of the bridge. Then he began a ritual. Slowly, the air grew colder, the shadows deepened. After a while, he trapped the spirit of the lurking river demon in a porcelain urn, sealing it with a charm to prevent its escape. That night, when the moon hung high in the velvet sky, Mana's translucent soul sat beneath a coconut tree by the river, lost in memories of his tragic life. On that fateful day, after toiling in the rice fields for Mr. Tunia, Man had returned home at dusk. He went to the well to wash up, unaware that his life was about to change forever. As he prepared to bathe, he heard a child's cry echoing from the house. It was Fook, his half-brother. Curious, Man approached the window and froze, his heart pounding as he overheard the conversation between Mrs. Gwyn and her son. The previous day, while Man was out fishing with his best friend Lon, Fook had ambushed him, demanding money for alcohol. Man, having brought no money, refused. Furious, Fook hurled insults at him, but Man, understanding his brother's drunkenness, simply walked away. Lon, however, couldn't bear the injustice and scolded Fook before they parted ways. Blinded by resentment, Fook lay in wait at a crossroads, seething with rage. When Lon walked home alone, Fook attacked him. In his drunken frenzy, he beat Lon to death without realizing it. Horrified, he tossed Lan's body into the fields and ran home, trembling as he confessed to Mrs. Gwyn. She, terrified of losing her son, embraced him tightly and promised to find a way to protect him. Man, trembling with shock, wrestled with his conscience. He wanted to report the crime, but love for his family held him back. As he stood in silent turmoil, Mrs. Gwyn spotted him through the window. Her face paled for a moment, but she quickly composed herself, inviting Man to dinner as if nothing had happened. Although starving, Man couldn't swallow a single bite. He wanted to beg Fook to turn himself in, but before he could speak, his vision blurred and darkness claimed him. When he awoke, he found himself floating above his own lifeless body. His mother and brother had drowned him to stage a cover-up, tearing a piece of his shirt to place in Lan's hand and dumping Mana's body into the river. The current carried him to the bridge, where his spirit had lingered for years, until he met Mai. He followed her, unable to leave, haunted by injustice and grief. Upon hearing the old man's account, and learning of Mrs. Gwyn's death and Fuchs' miserable existence, Man finally felt a flicker of peace. The ones who had wronged him had already paid the price. It was time to let go, time to end the strange bond tying him to Mai. He followed the old man to the mountain, agreeing to train and wait for the day he could truly pass on. Mai, following the old man's guidance, quickly recovered. Her health improved, and the chilling cold that once plagued her sleep faded away. After 7 days, her family climbed the mountain to thank the old man and complete the severing of her spiritual bond. As they departed, Mai felt an inexplicable emptiness. Tears blurred her vision, though she couldn't understand why. Once healed, she traveled to the city to visit Dung, who had barely survived her own brush with death. Dung, though shocked by Mai's tale, harbored no resentment. But Mai was consumed by guilt, feeling responsible for her friend's suffering. She quietly tended to Dung, peeling fruit as she gazed out the hospital window. Flashes of memories danced in her mind. The young man pulling her from the river, guiding her to places of ethereal beauty, shielding her from the demon's wrath even as he himself was torn apart. Though her heart ached, Mai knew the truth. Love between the living and the dead was a defiance of nature itself. No matter how deeply they yearned for one another, such a bond could never last. Sometimes, letting go is the greatest act of love. Dear listeners, this concludes the short story, Night of the Ghostly Encounter by Mai Yuyan. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful, and may the shadows bring no fear.